July 2019, a man was arrested for the brutal murder of his son's boyfriend, an arrest that would uncover a terrifying spree, claiming the lives of four more innocent people before the horrific truth came to light. James Harrison, 56 years old, was known in his community as a well-respected lawyer. He had built a successful career, had a beautiful home, and a seemingly perfect family. His wife, Linda, 53 years old, was devoted to their family, and they had two sons, Ryan, 25 years old, and Chandler, 20 years old. The Harrison family lived in a large, elegant house in the suburbs, where everything seemed to be in perfect order. But as the world would soon discover, beneath the surface, James had a dark and twisted side that no one could have imagined. James Harrison had spent his life hiding a secret that consumed him. Behind the image of the perfect family man was a man with insatiable desires for younger men. Over the years, James had secretly indulged in affairs with college students, meeting them in shady motels and manipulating them with his power and wealth. His fantasies grew darker as time went on, as he introduced pain and humiliation into his encounters, always craving control. James would add spices to wounds he inflicted, use objects that were not meant for pleasure, and find satisfaction in the pain of his partners. But what made James's secret even more dangerous was his complete inability to love in a normal way. His relationships were purely about control and gratification. This fear kept him careful until one day everything began to unravel. Ryan, the oldest son, had always been the pride of the family. He was bright, kind, and had a strong sense of self. But as he grew older, Ryan started to feel different from the other boys. It took him years to understand and accept that he was gay. When he finally came out to his parents, it was a difficult moment. Linda was shocked, but she eventually accepted her son's truth. James, however, had a different reaction. James was torn between his deep-seated homophobia and his hidden attraction to men. Seeing his own son living the life he had always hidden sent James into a spiral. He was obsessed with controlling his secret, but at the same time, he felt a twisted connection to Ryan's world. Then Ryan introduced his new boyfriend, Kyle, 24 years old, to the family. Kyle was an art student, shy and innocent, with a boyish charm that immediately caught James's attention. From the moment James saw Kyle, something dark and dangerous began to stir inside him. Kyle's vulnerability was like a magnet for James, who saw in him the perfect target for his twisted desires. James watched Kyle with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every time Kyle came over, James found excuses to be around him. He would offer Kyle drinks, invite him to talk about art, and slowly, James began to fantasize about having Kyle for himself. The danger of being caught only made it more exciting. But soon it became clear that James's interest in Kyle went beyond just fascination. His fantasies began to intertwine with his family life, and the lines between right and wrong blurred. James started to plot how he could make Kyle his next conquest. He knew it was wrong, but the thrill of the forbidden drove him to take bigger risks. One evening, James found the opportunity he had been waiting for. Linda and Ryan were out of town, and Chandler was spending the night at a friend's house. James invited Kyle over, under the pretense of discussing an art project. Kyle, trusting James, agreed to come over. As the night unfolded, James played the role of the perfect host. He offered Kyle a glass of wine, making sure it was just enough to lower his guard without raising suspicion. They talked about art, life, and Kyle's future, but all the while James's mind was focused on what he would do next. After some time, James suggested they move to his private study, a room filled with expensive books, leather chairs, and a large oak desk. It was a place where James felt in control. He closed the door behind them, and as Kyle admired the room, James made his move. He approached Kyle slowly, placing a hand on his shoulder, then his back. Kyle tensed up, sensing that something wasn't right, but James reassured him with a soft, almost fatherly tone. Before Kyle could react, James forcefully started to push him to the intimate act without consent. Kyle tried to push him away, but James was stronger, more determined. James quickly escalated the situation, pinning Kyle against the desk. He whispered things in Kyle's ear, dark, twisted things that made Kyle feel sick. James's hands were rough, pulling at Kyle's clothes, ignoring his pleas to stop. Kyle was trapped, unable to escape. As James overpowered him, He introduced the first element of his twisted fantasy, spices. He had prepared them in advance, hidden in a small jar in the desk drawer. James opened the jar, the sharp scent of chili powder filling the room. He smeared the spices onto Kyle's skin, targeting the most sensitive areas. Kyle screamed in pain as the burning sensation took over, but James was relentless. The more Kyle struggled, the more pleasure James derived from the situation. But Kyle wasn't prepared for the next level of James's cruelty. James reached for a small metal tool, a letter opener that he kept on his desk. It was sharp and cold, and James used it to trace lines across Kyle's chest, not deep enough to cause serious harm, but enough to leave marks. The spices burned even more as they mixed with the fresh cuts, and Kyle cried out in agony. James was in complete control, enjoying every moment of Kyle's suffering. He pushed Kyle further, introducing more elements of pain and humiliation, twisting Kyle's arms behind his back, using ropes to bind him to the desk, and whispering threats that made Kyle fear for his life. Kyle was completely at James's mercy, and James reveled in the power he held. After what felt like hours, James finally relented. Kyle was left on the floor, trembling and broken, covered in cuts and burns, his clothes torn. James looked down at him with a cold smile, satisfied with what he had done. He told Kyle to clean himself up and leave, warning him not to say a word to anyone about what had happened. But James wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. Kylie, too scared to tell Ryan what had happened, began to distance himself from the Harrison family. Ryan noticed the change and started asking questions, but Kyle was too terrified to say anything. As James tried to tighten his grip on Kyle, things began to spiral out of control. James knew that if Ryan or Linda found out the truth, his life would be over. But the more he tried to control the situation, the more it slipped through his fingers. But James wasn't prepared for the chaos that was about to unfold. The secrets that James had kept for so long were about to come crashing down, leading to a series of events that no one could have predicted. After that night in James's study, Kyle was left confused, ashamed, and deeply traumatized. The pain he had endured, both physical and emotional, was beyond anything he could have imagined. He was too frightened to go to the police, too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened. So he did the only thing he thought he could. He withdrew. But James, on the other hand, was exhilarated. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The thrill of power and control over Kyle had awakened something even darker within him. He began to crave more, needing to push Kyle further into his world of twisted desires. The affair between James and Kyle became a regular occurrence. James would find ways to lure Kyle back to the house, always ensuring that Linda and Ryan were out. Each encounter grew more extreme. James started tying Kyle up, blindfolding him, and introducing more painful and humiliating acts. He threatened to expose their affair if Kyle didn't comply with his increasingly depraved demands, leaving Kyle feeling trapped and helpless. James's need for control extended beyond the bedroom. He began to manipulate Kyle emotionally, convincing him that what they shared was something special, something unique that only the two of them could understand. He isolated Kyle from Ryan, making him believe that no one else could offer him what James could. Kyle, caught in a cycle of fear and dependency, started to pull away from Ryan more and more, his once bright and lively personality fading into a shadow of what it used to be. But soon it became clear that James's obsession was driving him to madness. His thoughts turned darker as he became less satisfied with their secret encounters. He wanted Kyle all to himself, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. James's fantasies grew more violent. He began to imagine scenarios where he could eliminate anyone who stood in his way, especially Ryan. The idea of killing his own son was too horrific for him to seriously consider, but he couldn't shake the thoughts from his mind. He decided that if he couldn't have Kyle all to himself, no one could. His behavior became more erratic. He grew paranoid, convinced that Kyle was planning to leave him, or worse, expose him. James started monitoring Kyle's every move, demanding to know where he was at all times. He would call Kyle at odd hours, insisting that he come over immediately. If Kyle hesitated, James would remind him of the consequences. What would happen if Ryan or the rest of the world found out? And for a while, it seemed like James had found the perfect balance, controlling Kyle's life without anyone knowing. But as the weeks passed, subtle changes began to surface. Kyle grew more and more distant from Ryan, who started to suspect that something was terribly wrong. Ryan noticed the bruises, the way Kyle would flinch at sudden movements, the vacant look in his eyes. He tried to confront Kyle about it, but Kyle always brushed it off, too scared to tell the truth. Then one night, James took things to a terrifying new level. He staged a mock kidnapping during one of their encounters, blindfolding Kyle and taking him to a remote location outside the city. The place was an old abandoned warehouse, filled with rusted machinery and broken windows. James subjected Kyle to hours of psychological torture, playing mind games and threatening him with knives, ropes, and other objects. He made Kyle believe that he was going to kill him, that there was no escape. The fear in Kyle's eyes only fueled James's sadistic pleasure. Kyle, now completely broken, was too terrified to resist. He became a shell of his former self, submitting to James's every whim in a desperate attempt to survive. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and began to waste away. James, obsessed and consumed by his own darkness, didn't care. He only wanted to maintain control, to keep Kyle under his thumb no matter the cost. But he also feared what might happen next. Linda, who had always been the nurturing mother, started noticing strange behavior from James. He was more secretive than usual, and there were long stretches of time where he would disappear without explanation. She didn't know what was going on, but she sensed that something was very wrong. She began to fear for the safety of her family. But that night, James's thoughts turned darker. He discovered that Kyle had been confiding in a close friend about the affair. It was just a small detail, something Kyle mentioned in passing, trying to find some way to cope with the nightmare his life had become. But for James, it was enough to push him over the edge. He decided that Kyle had to be silenced, permanently. The decision didn't come all at once. James thought about it for days, weeks even, trying to justify it to himself. He convinced himself that he was doing Kyle a favor, that ending his life would be better than letting him suffer. He imagined how he would do it, quickly, quietly, making sure that no one ever found out. And as James's mind spiraled deeper into madness, the plan began to take shape. He started gathering the tools he would need: a gun, a silencer, some rope, and a bag to dispose of the body. He rehearsed the scenario in his mind over and over until he was certain that nothing could go wrong. The only thing left to do was wait for the right moment. On the evening of the planned murder, James invited Kyle over, pretending that this would be just another one of their secret meetings. He promised Kyle that they would resolve everything, giving Kyle a false sense of hope that this nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Kyle, too broken and desperate to see through the lie, agreed to come, clinging to the belief that this would all be over soon. But Kyle wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. The night began like all the others. James greeted Kyle with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, offering him a drink and leading him to the study where their encounters usually took place. The room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn to keep the world out. Kyle sat down on the familiar leather couch, feeling a sense of unease wash over him. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place it. James was being too nice, too accommodating, and it put Kyle on edge. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly sinister. James kept a close eye on Kyle, watching his every move, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. When he finally decided the moment was right, James introduced a new element into their encounter: chloroform. He presented it as something to spice up their usual routine, pretending it was just another game they would play. But soon it became clear that James's interest in Kyle went beyond their agreement. Kyle, already feeling weakened and disoriented, tried to resist when James brought the chloroform-soaked cloth closer. He pushed James's hand away, shaking his head in fear, but James was too strong. He grabbed Kyle's wrists, forcing him down onto the couch, and pressed the cloth over Kyle's face. Kyle struggled, his heart pounding in his chest, but the fumes were overwhelming. James held him down with a grip that was too tight, too forceful, until Kyle's thrashing slowed and his body began to go limp. When Kyle finally lost consciousness, James wasted no time. He dragged Kyle's limp body to the bathroom, his movements methodical and precise. He had planned this down to the last detail, making sure that everything would go according to plan. James filled the bathtub with water, his hands steady as he turned the knobs, watching the water rise. He positioned Kyle in the tub, his body slumped over the edge, as if he had simply fallen asleep and drowned. But that night, James's thoughts turned darker. James was about to walk away, to let the water do its work, when something inside him snapped. The anger, the rage, the need for control that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly boiled over. He couldn't just leave it at that. He needed to feel the power one more time, to make sure Kyle would never be a threat to him again. In a fit of rage, James grabbed Kyle's head and forced it under the water. Kyle's body jerked as the cold water filled his lungs, but James didn't let go. He held Kyle down with all his strength, watching as the life drained out of him. Kyle's struggles grew weaker, his limbs twitching as he tried to fight back. But it was no use. James had made up his mind, and he wasn't going to stop until Kyle was dead. But she wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. When Kyle's body finally went still, James pulled him out of the tub and laid him on the bathroom floor. But even in death, James was not satisfied. The rage that had driven him to kill was still burning inside, and he needed to release it. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, the sharpest one he could find, and returned to the bathroom. He stood over Kyle's lifeless body, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. James didn't just want Kyle dead, he wanted to make sure that he could never hurt him again. With a cold, detached expression, James began to mutilate Kyle's body. He cut deep into Kyle's flesh, marking him in a final act of dominance. James carved lines and symbols into Kyle's skin, his hands steady as he worked, taking satisfaction in the destruction he was causing. The bathroom floor was soon covered in blood, a gruesome tableau of violence and horror. The scene was a stark reminder of the brutality that had just unfolded and the depths of depravity to which James had sunk. But soon it became clear that James's obsession was driving him to madness. When James was finally done, he stepped back and looked at what he had done. The anger was gone, replaced by a sense of cold satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done, and now he needed to clean up the mess. After the brutal murder of Kyle, James's first priority was to ensure that no one would ever find out what he had done. His meticulous nature took over as he methodically cleaned the crime scene. He scrubbed away every trace of blood, disposed of the chloroform, and carefully removed any fingerprints or DNA evidence that could tie him to the act. James, who had always been a planner, approached this task with the same precision he used in his legal work. Once the bathroom was spotless, James turned his attention to Kyle's lifeless body. He wrapped Kyle in plastic, making sure no blood or bodily fluids would leak out, and then stuffed the body into a large duffel bag. The bag was heavy, the weight of what he had done bearing down on him. But James moved with purpose. He had already planned the next steps. What had started as a dark fantasy was slowly morphing into a terrifying reality. Under the cover of night, James loaded the duffel bag into the trunk of his Toyota Camry and drove to a remote location far from the Harrison family home. The road was dark and deserted, the trees closing in on either side as the car sped through the night. James drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves against the car's windows. He had chosen this location carefully, a place where no one would stumble upon his secret. But she feared what might happen next. When he arrived, James got out of the car and began digging a shallow grave in a secluded spot. The earth was hard, but he kept digging, his mind focused on the task at hand. When the grave was deep enough, James lowered Kyle's body into it, covering it with dirt and foliage. He worked quickly but efficiently, making sure the grave was well hidden from prying eyes. Once the grave was covered, James returned to his car and drove home. He felt a sense of relief as he washed away the dirt and sweat in the shower, as if he could scrub away not just the physical evidence, but also the weight of what he had done. But the relief was fleeting, replaced by a growing sense of paranoia. James knew that this facade was fragile, and he became increasingly anxious that someone would uncover the truth. The next day, James took further steps to cover his tracks. He burned Kyle's personal belongings in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the last traces of his victim. He hacked into Kyle's social media accounts, sending out messages that suggested Kyle had decided to leave town to pursue an opportunity abroad. James was meticulous, planting fake clues that hinted Kyle was unhappy in his relationship with Ryan and had been planning to leave for some time. But soon it became clear that James's plans went beyond just one murder. Ryan, devastated by Kyle's sudden disappearance, was heartbroken but had no reason to suspect his father. James's carefully constructed narrative held up, at least for a while. But as the days turned into weeks, James's paranoia grew. He began to see threats everywhere, imagining that people were watching him, that someone would discover what he had done. James's paranoia reached a peak when Linda began to notice the strange behavior of her husband. She saw the sudden disappearance of Kyle's belongings, the way James was more on edge, more secretive. She found a scrap of Kyle's clothing hidden in the corner of the fireplace, a piece of evidence that James had missed. And there was the faint scent of chloroform lingering in James's office, a smell that shouldn't have been there. James's obsession went beyond just control. When Linda confronted James, demanding to know what was going on, he realized his carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse. James couldn't let her expose him, not after everything he had done. In a fit of rage, James decided that Linda had to be silenced permanently. One evening, as Linda prepared for bed, James spiked her wine with a lethal dose of sleeping pills. He watched as she drank the wine, oblivious to the danger, and then slipped into unconsciousness. James waited until she was completely out, then dragged her to the garage. He placed her in the driver's seat of her car, started the engine, and left the garage door closed, ensuring that the carbon monoxide would do the rest. But that night, James's thoughts turned darker. The next morning, James discovered Linda's lifeless body in the garage. He called the police, his voice frantic, pretending to be a devastated husband who had just lost his wife to a terrible accident. The authorities, finding no immediate signs of foul play, ruled Linda's death as an unfortunate case of carbon monoxide poisoning. James had silenced another threat, but his secret was still safe, for now. He had gotten away with murder, twice, but the sense of control that had driven him was now turning into an obsession. He became more paranoid, more unstable, and the people around him began to notice. And soon Chandler, the younger son, would be next to discover just how far his father was willing to go to keep his secrets hidden. As Chandler watched his family unravel, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kyle's disappearance, his mother's sudden death, everything felt off. Chandler, at just 20 years old, had always been the quieter of the Harrison siblings, more observant, more thoughtful. As his father's behavior grew more erratic, Chandler began to suspect that the answers he was looking for weren't far from home, and his suspicions would soon lead him down a dangerous path. Chandler started by going through his mother's belongings, searching for any clue that might explain the unsettling events around him. He didn't expect to find much, perhaps a note, a letter, but what he uncovered was far more incriminating. Tucked away in the back of her closet, hidden under a stack of old sweaters, was a journal. Linda had been writing in it for years, documenting her thoughts, worries, and, most alarmingly, her growing concerns about James. As Chandler flipped through the pages, his heart sank. Linda had noticed the same things he had: James's erratic behavior, his sudden mood swings, the strange smells in the house that he couldn't place. She had even written about a piece of Kyle's clothing she had found in the fireplace, something she hadn't had the chance to confront James about before her untimely death. Chandler's heart raced as he realized the gravity of his discovery. One night, unable to bear the weight of what he knew, Chandler decided to confront his father. He waited until late, when the house was quiet and James was alone in his study. As he stood outside the door, his hand trembling on the doorknob, Chandler knew there was no turning back. Inside, James was sitting at his desk, the soft glow of his computer screen casting eerie shadows across his face. When Chandler entered, James looked up, startled. Chandler wasted no time. He placed Linda's journal on the desk in front of his father, his voice trembling as he demanded answers. But soon it became clear that James was more dangerous than Chandler could have imagined. James, and already on edge from his previous murders, felt his world closing in. He had silenced Kyle and Linda to protect his secrets, and now his own son was threatening to expose him. James realized in that moment that he had no choice. He had to silence Chandler as well. He forced a smile, pretending to be calm. He told Chandler he wanted to talk, to explain everything, but he needed Chandler to help him with something in the basement first. Chandler, wary but desperate for answers, agreed. Chandler wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. In the dimly lit basement, James led Chandler to an old, unused storage room. He told Chandler there was a leak in the ceiling and asked him to check it out. As Chandler bent down to inspect the floor, James moved quickly. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench and, with a cold, calculated strike, hit Chandler on the back of the head. Chandler crumpled to the floor, unconscious, blood pooling around him. James didn't hesitate. He dragged Chandler's limp body to the bottom of the basement stairs and staged the scene to look like an accidental fall. The storage room was dark and cluttered, the perfect place for an accident. James arranged the tools and debris just so, creating the illusion that Chandler had tripped in the dark, hitting his head on the concrete floor. When the authorities arrived, James played the part of the grieving father once more. He told them he had found Chandler at the bottom of the stairs when he came down to check on him. The police, finding no immediate evidence of foul play, ruled Chandler's death as a tragic accident. James's secret was safe for now. But even as James breathed a sigh of relief, he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. James was relieved that his secret remained buried, but the strain of living a double life was taking its toll. He was haunted by what he had done, first to Kyle, then to Linda, and now to his own son. The paranoia that had driven him to kill was now consuming him, making him increasingly unstable. But there was one more person left, Ryan, his eldest son. Ryan, devastated by Kyle's disappearance and the deaths of his mother and brother, was beginning to unravel emotionally. Ryan had always been close to Chandler, and the loss hit him hard. As he searched for answers, he began to notice things that didn't add up. Things his father had said, things he had done. Ryan started to suspect that James might be involved in the tragedies that had befallen their family. But soon it became clear that Ryan's suspicions would lead him to the most horrifying truth of all. One night, Ryan decided to confront James, just as Chandler had. He waited until they were alone, then accused his father of lying and demanded to know the truth. James, or realizing that Ryan was the last person who could expose him, made a split-second decision. He had to eliminate Ryan, his own son, to protect his secrets, and he planned it in the worst way possible. James invited Ryan on a fishing trip to a remote lake, pretending to want to reconnect and grieve together. Ryan, desperate for some peace, agreed. They drove to the lake in James's Toyota Camry, the silence between them thick with tension. Once they were on the boat, far from shore, James revealed his true intentions. In a cold, calculated move, he pushed Ryan overboard and watched as his son struggled in the water. Ryan, realizing too late what was happening, cried out for help, but James turned the boat away, leaving Ryan to drown. Ryan's body disappeared beneath the surface, and with it, any hope James had of redemption. As James returned to shore, he claimed that Ryan had a tragic accident while fishing, but James knew he was running out of time. The walls were closing in, and the police were getting closer to uncovering the truth. But soon it became clear that James's dark secrets could not stay hidden forever. James Harrison had carefully planned each of his crimes, convinced that his meticulous nature would keep him safe. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and the trail of death he left behind was too obvious to ignore. As the days passed after Ryan's disappearance, the police began to piece together the puzzle. James had made one crucial mistake. He underestimated the determination of those seeking justice. And for a while, it seemed like James had covered his tracks perfectly, but soon it became clear that the walls were closing in. The first sign of trouble for James came when the police, following up on Ryan's disappearance, obtained a search warrant for the Harrison home. They meticulously combed through the house, looking for anything that might explain the string of tragedies that had befallen the family. In James's study, they found Linda's journal, the journal that Chandler had discovered before his death. In it were detailed entries documenting her growing suspicions about James and his increasingly erratic behavior. The police then discovered the bloodstains on the basement stairs where Chandler had supposedly fallen. The stains had been cleaned, but not well enough. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood matched Chandler's DNA. This, combined with Linda's journal, raised serious doubts about the official cause of Chandler's death. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. As they dug deeper into James's digital life, they uncovered a series of chilling emails and search histories that painted a dark picture of his psyche. The searches were disturbing. How to make a murder look like an accident, chloroform dosage, and how to drown someone silently. The investigators began to realize that they were dealing with a man capable of unspeakable horrors. The police also discovered that James had hacked into Kyle's social media accounts, sending out messages that suggested he had left town. But the tone of these messages was off. Cold, detached, unlike the real Kyle. Friends who knew Kyle well came forward, stating that he would never leave without saying a proper goodbye. This further fueled the suspicion that Kyle hadn't left of his own accord. The turning point came when the police connected the dots between the deaths of Linda, Chandler, and Ryan. The authorities obtained a warrant to search James's digital devices, and what they found was shocking. Not only had James meticulously planned and executed the murders, but he had kept digital records of his dark fantasies, including notes on how he would deal with anyone who got too close to the truth. James's twisted world was beginning to crumble around him. Finally, they found the ultimate piece of evidence: James's car, a Toyota Camry. Forensic experts examined the vehicle and found traces of blood in the trunk. The blood matched Kyle's DNA, proving beyond a doubt that James had transported Kyle's body in the car. It was the evidence they needed to arrest James. James Harrison was arrested at his home in the early hours of a cold, gray morning. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, James remained eerily calm. The man who had once been a respected lawyer was now exposed as a cold-blooded killer. The trial of James Harrison became a media sensation, with the public horrified by the details of his crimes. The prosecution laid out a damning case, piece by piece, showing how James had manipulated, tortured, and killed those closest to him to protect his secrets. They presented the evidence of Kyle's murder, Linda's poisoning, Chandler's staged accident, and Ryan's drowning as part of a horrifying pattern of violence. The courtroom was filled with tension as witnesses took the stand. Friends of Kyle testified about his relationship with Ryan and the sudden, unexplained change in his behavior. Forensic experts detailed how James had staged the deaths to look like accidents, but how the evidence told a different story. The most emotional testimony came from Linda's sister, who spoke about Linda's growing fears and suspicions in the weeks leading up to her death. The most chilling moment came when the prosecution revealed James's digital footprint. The jury was shown the search histories, the hacked messages, and the notes James had kept on his computer. These were not the actions of a man driven by sudden madness. They were the meticulous plans of a cold, calculating mind. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that James was suffering from a mental disorder, that he had been driven to insanity by the stress of his personal life. But the prosecution countered that James had known exactly what he was doing, that he had taken deliberate steps to cover his tracks and silence those who might expose him. It became clear that there was no escaping the truth. After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. James Harrison was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The judge, in his final remarks, condemned James for his heinous crimes, stating that his actions were those of a man who had lost all sense of morality and humanity. James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So James Harrison, the man who had everything, wealth, power, and a seemingly perfect family, was left with nothing but the cold, hard reality of his prison cell. His life, once so carefully controlled, was now defined by the bars that kept him locked away from the world he had betrayed.